Okay, good afternoon. Welcome, everybody, members of the Girard Kring, students, everybody interested, also people watching this session online. My name is Hans Weigand. I'm chairman of the Dutch Girard Society and also chairing this session today. Okay, let me briefly tell you about the program of today. So we first will listen to the Girard lecture of Nidesh Lawtoo. That will take about 45 minutes. And then we start a discussion, which will be first introduced by two respondents, Daan Savert and Barry Forsterbos. Okay, so far for the program. Then let me introduce our speaker today, Nidesh Lawtoo. Nidesh was trained in comparative literature, continental philosophy, and film media studies, and is now professor of modern and contemporary European literature and culture at Leiden University. Previously, he held positions at the University of Lausanne, Johns Hopkins University, and KU Leuven, where he also led an ERC-funded project titled Homo Mimeticus, Theory and Criticism, from 17 to 22. His interdisciplinary work reframes the ancient concept of mimesis. René Girard applied this concept in an innovative way in his analysis of desire in the novel, his claim being that human desire is deeply mimetic, imitating. Lawtoo builds on Girard, among others, but focuses on mimetic phenomena in modern times, for example, on social media and internet, and also visible in fascistic trends in politics. And that's certainly a timely and urgent topic today. Two books of Nidesh Lawtoo on Homo Mimeticus and on New Fascism have been translated recently in Dutch by Barry Forstenbos, present here as respondent. I would like to recall also here that the first Girard lecture was presented by Professor Hans Achterhuis, and other presenters include the novelist Willem-Jan Otten and the economist Johan Graafland. We are honored that this year Nidesh Lawtoo was found willing to deliver the fifth Girard lecture with the title The Urgency of Mimetic Studies, From Imitation to New Fascism. Nidesh, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Hans, for this very kind introduction. Het is een eer de Girard-lezing te mogen geven. Leider genoeg, mijn Nederlands is niet goed genoeg. So I will be speaking English. So thanks for your patience, and thanks also for those who are joining online. The English language somehow is adequate to the topic at hand, the urgency of mimetic studies, because the phenomenon that I focus on is the phenomenon that the entire world is currently focusing on. And given two candidates, one of which is a criminal candidate who attempted an insurrection against American democracy, and the possibility of electing a woman for the first time in the 21st century, a species self-proclaimed Homo sapiens, wise man, opted for the criminal. So that's an interesting problem to unpack. Obviously, economics, inflation is usually emphasized, and we know that in addition to being Homo sapiens, we have been defined as being Homo economicus, but the idea that a millionaire would care for the working class is itself, from the point of view of Homo economicus, difficult to understand. So my hypothesis, very much in line with René Girard, is indeed that we are not only Homo sapiens, we are not only Homo economicus or Homo faber, we are also, and above all, Homo mimeticus. And I say this at a moment in which phenomena on the far right that deny science, deny climate change, and generate scapegoating mechanism are not only confined to the US, but we find them in Europe as well, including in the Netherlands. There was a protest on Monday against education cuts, and I kind of delivered this lecture very much in the spirit of support of the protests against the cuts that will be probably inflicted against the university. This is a moment in which we need education. And I think this is a phenomenon that illustrates it very clearly. Now, my starting point to think about the relationship between mimesis and what I call new fascism goes back to one of my favorite philosophers, who is Friedrich Nietzsche, who argued in Gay Science that there will be ages in which actors, all kinds of actors, will be the real masters. And Nietzsche was trained as a philologist in classics, and he knew the origins of the concept of mimesis, which comes from mimos, which is translated as performance or actor. There is a theatrical dimension internal to the notion of mimesis that links it to performativity. And indeed, the case of Trump, which will be serving as our case study tonight, is somebody who was very much trained in acting and managed to perform this very surprising transition in 2016 from the host of a TV reality show to the president of the United States. That's how far the powers of mimesis go. We see here in this image Trump facing a female candidate, and in political reality, we saw the debate between Trump and Kamala Harris, and despite the obvious let's say, rhetorical superiority of Harris during the debate, and the fact that Trump, as I mentioned, staged an insurrection in 2021, nonetheless, he managed to rely on what I call the powers of mimesis, which include performativity, contagion, scapegoating, violence, in order to come to power again. So whenever the question comes up, why does mimesis matter in the 21st century, this ancient Greek concept, I think here we have a case study that allows us to foreground the importance of rethinking this concept. So what is then mimetic studies? Since that is part of my title, the urgency of mimetic studies. We live in the digital age, and some might have a suspicion as to why teachers are still needed. After all, we can ask ChatGPT anything, right? So why not ask ChatGPT? What is mimetic studies? And here is the answer that comes up. Mimetic studies is an interdisciplinary field that examines the role of imitation, or mimesis, in human behavior, culture, and society. The concept of mimesis refers to the act of imitating, copying, or representing something, and it has been explored in various intellectual traditions, especially philosophy, sociology, anthropology, and literary theory. It's not bad. As a kind of general introduction, I have to admit, continues as follows. In modern times, mimetic studies, the central focus is often on the ways in which individuals, groups, and societies imitate each other, especially in the context of desires, behaviors, and cultural practices. The field is heavily influenced by the work of the French philosopher and anthropologist René Girard, who developed the theory of mimetic desire, which asserts that human desires are not inherently individual, but are learned through imitation of others. Now, here is an audience of Girard specialists who can assess the accuracy of this general introduction. But indeed, Girard was one of the theorists that I gravitated towards in order to think about this emerging phenomenon of the cool new fascism on the contemporary political scene. And a friend of Girard, the philosopher Michel Serres, have this definition of philosophy as philosopher c'est anticiper. And according to this definition, Girard helped me somehow to anticipate the danger of Trump at a time in which he was not taken seriously. I started writing this book in 2016 before Trump's election. So stepping back to Girard was important. There were a number of other precursors that I would like to acknowledge. One of them was the Italian semiologist, philosopher Umberto Eco, who had written an article on the New Yorker in the 90s where he said that Ur-fascism, he defines eternal fascism or Ur-fascism as something that can come back under the most innocent of disguises. Our duty is to uncover it and to point our finger at any of its new instances every day in every part of the world. I used this phrase by Umberto Eco as the epigraph of my book. I think Umberto Eco gives a list of the characteristics of what he calls Ur-fascism that still resonate today. The cult of tradition, of a mythic past that was somehow greater. The idea that if you disagree with the person in charge, that is a treason. The fear of difference, the appeal to a frustrated middle class and working class, I would add, machismo, populism, and a type of simple language that Orwell called newspeak are some of the characteristics that Umberto Eco uses to define Ur-fascism. He doesn't define it as an ideology. Ideologically, fascism is a protean phenomenon, but more as something that occurs at the level of emotions. And so building on Umberto Eco and a number of other scholars like Timothy Snyder, William Connolly, and Jason Stanley, who were writing about fascism at that moment, I thought that I could supplement this diagnostic of Ur-fascism from the point of view of concepts like contagion, or myth, or community, in order to pay attention to the new media. And the new in new fascism is indeed very much linked to the new media more than the messages behind it. So here is where then Girard became very useful. The first chapter of the book, and I'm not going to summarize the entire book, but just to establish some links with Girard's mimetic theory. Mimetic theory is a theory that starts with fiction, right? That was pointed out by Hans. The first book, The Seed, Desire, and the Novel, it's a book on the romantic novel, where the theory of mimetic desire is developed. This idea that identification with a model orients desire is a crucial starting point in Girard, and that leads to rivalry. In a way, if you have a look at The Apprentice, which was the TV show that Donald Trump had, you have a casebook study of how mimetic desire and rivalry are actually staged in the TV show, in which Donald Trump plays the role of the master, who fires them, a scapegoat, and is empowered by this gesture of "you're fired." That was repeated like a mantra during the elections. So moving then from fiction, from reality TV to politics TV, a form of, let's say, transition in which performativity is not limited to the sphere of a reality TV show, but became a weapon in political practice. Now, we've also seen this summer a radical turn of events in which the attempted assassination of Donald Trump failed, and he could play the role of a sacrificial victim who survived, a sort of savior, who then continued to amplify fears and resentment and grievances in the crowd, and specifically directing his violence against immigrants, a form of mimetic racism and sexism as well, transphobia. So these elements that were internal to the Apprentice show became central to his politics and are still central to his politics. And in the book, I'm trying to account for how Girard can help us think about this transition. Now, I don't want to repeat the book. The book is available, thanks also to a very excellent translation in Dutch. But as Hans pointed out at the beginning, there are a number of other mimetic phenomena that are circulating that are new, that deserve attention. One of them is actually not very new, but it has to do with the specific rhetoric that Donald Trump uses to galvanize crowds. And there is a tradition, crowd psychology, that I think is very helpful to account for this kind of contagion which spreads among the masses. Donald Trump, you noticed, is very, let's say, savvy in staging himself as this kind of everyman, like working at McDonald's or a garbage man, relying also on sexual obscenity. These are elements which Georges Bataille called abject. And Georges Bataille, in an essay on the psychological structure of fascism, argued that the abject generates movements of attraction and repulsion that are central to fascism. Twitter and Donald Trump proximity to Elon Musk, the owner of now X, obviously play a role. Trump already during his first term as president could use his social media to basically be on a very private person, constant communication with his electorate. So creating bubbles in which people would be caught in lies, big lies. The use of AI is another manifestation that is new, right? They're eating the pets, and we've seen this proliferation of images of heroic, which is ridiculous from a critical distance, and yet it seems to work. And then, of course, the use of transphobia and ads that targeted Kamala Harris, saying that Kamala Harris is for them, Donald Trump is for you. So this is something that Judith Butler would call a phantasm. It's a kind of projection of fears onto transphobia. There's even a movie that just came out titled The Apprentice, which has some critical elements, but it's really a glorification of Trump's charisma, which is going to play in his favor. The movie won some prizes at Cannes. So there is a plurality of mimetic phenomena that call for what I call mimetic status. I see some students are coming in, finishing classes. And so I couldn't resist the temptation to ask ChatGPT a follow-up question. Then who funded then mimetic studies, since mimetic studies was mentioned at the beginning? And the answer is mimetic studies, also known as mimetics. Maybe you've heard this term, I've never heard it. Here you see ChatGPT kind of losing its grip a little bit. Does not have a single founder, as it's a multidisciplinary field that draws from various intellectual traditions and has evolved over time. I like that very much. I do think that there is a plurality of theories of mimesis that cannot be linked to one figure only. However, one of the key figures associated with the development of mimetic theory, particularly in the context of literature anthropology, is, once again, René Girard. Notice, and here I play the role of the mere human intelligence against the artificial intelligence, in which mimetic studies becomes mimetic theory. But the two shouldn't be treated as synonymous. I think that there are important continuities, but also differences between mimetic studies and mimetic theory. So I want to just say a few things specifically about mimetic studies as a parenthesis before moving more into the specific concepts that are central to it. Mimetic studies has indeed a kind of plural origins. As Hans pointed out, it's linked to a project that I led at KU Leuven, where I invited a number of figures in philosophy, the neurosciences, political theory, to join forces to think new forms of mimesis. So it's not an individual endeavor. I had a team, it was a collective effort. And the first manifestation of mimetic studies came out in a series of special issues and journals that I co-edited with my team. And the first reference to mimetic studies is in books that I published with Bill Johnson's series at Michigan State University Press. Shout out to Bill Johnson if he's listening. That's a fantastic series that promotes the importance of rethinking mimesis. As well as Leuven University Press, 2 books on Homo mimeticus, one of which is a volume that assembles a number of essays from international scholars I co-edited with Marina Garcia Granero. And the last volume that recently come out is a volume on the post-human. So these are just some of the texts that are out that deal specifically with mimetic studies, and where Girard is one of the figures, but not the only one. I cannot show it in detail today, but in my work, I try to read and analyze as close as possible a selective number of texts that deal with mimesis in the history of philosophy and literature. The Republic comes to mind, or Nietzsche's Birth of Tragedy, where he posits two forms of imitation, the Apollonian and the Dionysian, or Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, where he defines Kurtz as a leader who is hollow at the core, and yet he managed to electrify large meetings on the popular front. That's a quote verbatim that resonates, I think, with hollow leaders that we see today on the political scene. I mentioned Georges Bataille, Lucie Rigaret, feminist philosopher, and of course, Girard, La violence à la sacrée, I would say, for me, is the most important book of Girard. So I want to stress that these new concepts that mimetic studies proposes emerge out of close readings of specific texts. And I cannot demonstrate it in a short lecture. It would take much time, but I want to give you, in the time that remains, some of these concepts linked to mimetic studies and give you a sense of how concepts are made or created by keeping the example that we started with, the case of Trump. I should also mention, by the way, that the images, some of the images that you see are from my spouse, who is an artist, and I'm blessed to always rely on her artistic craft when I need a specific image. This is a discus drawer that she did specifically for a volume, so thank you, Michi. So mimetic theory, we take for granted that desire is mimetic, if you've read Girard. And taking distance, a genealogical distance from the theory, I started to wonder why this emphasis on desire. It works, absolutely, but why this focus on mimetic desire? And in Achève Clausewitz, in Puzzling to the End, one of Girard's last book, Girard acknowledges the influence of Alexandre Kojève's interpretation of Hegel, where it's a question of the desire of the other. It's a phrase that was in the air in the 60s. A lot of philosophers streamed to Kojève's interpretation of Hegel, to his seminar. There was Merleau-Ponty, Sartre, Bataille, Lacan, le désir de l'autre. So we've heard this phrase before, and it's specific of that particular French context. We also know that Girard divides desire, I mean, it links, but it also distinguishes between desire and identification or mimesis, and that the two lead to an ambivalent relation to a model that leads to rivalry and also a sacrificial murder. Girard posits a sacrificial murder as, at the origins of culture. Now, these are some affinities with Freud. It's not the same as Freud, but this distinction in two emotional ties, ambivalent relationship to the father figure, and a sacrifice at the origin of culture, you'll find it in Totem and Taboo, for instance. And in my work, I try to show that there is a certain Freudianism, Hegelianism internal to mimetic theory, that it's specific of the 60s, and that leads Girard to emphasize bad mimesis, rivalry, violence, and scapegoating. In a triangular system or form. I think this system works, and the theory is very effective in analyzing that dynamic. But my question was, can we think of other ways of accounting for mimetic powers? And so my intuition was that instead of focusing on mimetic desire alone, I would focus on mimetic pathos. I take this concept of pathos, which is difficult to translate, a Greek concept, could be translated as affect. It's once again an influence from Nietzsche, who defines the will to power as not a being, not a becoming, but a pathos. And my assumption was that all affects, all emotions are mimetic. This is in line with a certain return of attention to affect, performativity, embodiment, contagion, the affective turn or the performative turn. But my starting point was really modernist and Nietzschean, and I developed in this book, The Phantom of the Ego, where theory of mimetic pathos is first articulated. The point I want to stress is that mimetic pathos can be both good and bad. It cuts both ways. It's genus-faced. It can lead to fascism, but it can also lead to sympathy, compassion, joy, communities that are closed or communities that are open to others. And so what I found in the texts that I analyzed and that I close read is a certain movement, not a system or a structure, but a movement between, well, let's say, good mimesis and bad mimesis, or let's say a more sympathetic form of imitation and one that is more driven by violence. And maybe we've seen that manifestation during the debate between Trump and Harris. Emotions swung both ways. They were both working on our mimetic registers, but in different ways. And so this movement or oscillation leads to the second concept that I want to introduce, which is the one of pathos of distance. So once again, a Nietzschean concept. And you could say, well, the notion of pathos has to do with our being imitative, right? We are open to affective contagion. We are relational creatures. And the ego can easily be turned into a copy or a phantom of the ego, as Nietzsche says. This is evident in crowd phenomena. Violent pathos is one of its most obvious manifestations. And Nietzsche defines it as a sickness, an emotional sickness. But at the same time, he speaks of a pathos of distance. And my assumption is that the fact that we are open to mimesis, to mimetic affect, doesn't prevent us from taking critical distance from it, an anti-mimetic dimension internal to human beings. So here you have an ego that it can be developed, it can develop a critique that is more distant. Very often writers of mimesis are radical individualists, and Girard, I think, is also one of them. He pays attention to the individual, even though it's an individual that is related to others. The focus might be more conceptual and less affective, and the ability to develop a critical logos or discourse is something that is central to the anti-mimetic dimension. A diagnostic therapy. So mimesis as being both a sickness and a therapy, and the Greek concept there is pharmakon, which was developed by Derrida, and Girard was familiar with it. So the mimetic and the anti-mimetic tension can lead to a pathological politics, but also to what I call a pathological politics. And with pathological, I mean an interplay of emotions and reason. I'm not arguing for a subject who is distant and completely rational, a subject of Aufklärung, but that there is an interplay between our rational faculties and our emotional faculties. And once again, if we looked at the facial mimicry at play during the only debate that Trump and Kamala Harris had, we see how these emotions and the logic behind it are visibly displayed and perhaps being more important than what they actually say, how they actually perform, how they actually manifest their thoughts and their emotions. Why are we so attentive to human faces? Why is it so important to pay attention to the face? We all remember Andrew Meltzow's discovery in the 70s that newborns imitate from birth, that we don't need to learn to imitate, but it's through imitation that we learn. The assumption there is that relations, mimetic relations, precede the ego, that the relation is constitutive, and that adults, even though we like to think of ourselves as individuals, as autonomous and detached, we remain unconsciously open to this pathos, for good and ill. It goes both ways. And we can take at the same time a critical distance from it. So this leads to the third concept that I want to introduce. After pathos of distance, this notion of pathologies. And it's probably the most difficult one. So I'll give you a quote by Nietzsche where he describes what I mean. His term for it is perspectivism. And Nietzsche was suffering from a variety of sicknesses. And he always argued that it's important to look at health from the perspective of sickness and at sickness from the perspective of health. He says to look from a morbid perspective toward healthier concepts and values. And again, conversely, to look down from the abundance and certainty of rich life into the secret labor of the instinct of decadence. This is what I've practiced most. Meine längste Übung. He's a specialist of changing perspective, looking at sickness from the angle of health and vice versa, a passive vulnerability to a mimetic emotion, something that we suffer, a pathology, can actively be put to critical use to diagnose this mimetic pathos. I think Nietzsche thought, but not only, many thinkers of mimesis have a direct experience of this phenomenon. And then they use that experience, that pathos, that emotion, in order to develop a theory. Now, in my work so far, I've paid attention to the ways in which a pathos, a pathology, can be developed into a pathology, into a critical discourse, a narrative, a short story, a film, a philosophical system. But it also goes the other way. A theory, a pathology, a theory of mimetic pathos, can turn into a pathology. And here that brings us back to the question of politics that we've never left. Peter Thiel is a billionaire entrepreneur, one of the first financiers of Facebook. Facebook took off thanks to Peter Thiel's investment early on, and he was also a student of René Girard at Stanford. And he writes in 2009 already that René Girard will be seen as truly one of the greatest intellectuals. One would really be struck just by his incredible perceptiveness into human nature. I think Girard is one of the last greatest generalists who was really interested in everything. And I actually agree with Peter Thiel's evaluation. Girard is a generalist and is a remarkable intellectual. What I want to emphasize is the next quote. I don't tell you who it is, but probably you can guess. I read it to you. I began to wonder where his, Peter Thiel's, religious belief came from, which led to René Girard, the French philosopher whom he apparently studied under at Stanford. Girard's theory of mimetic rivalry, that we tend to compete over the things that other people want, spoke directly to some of the pressures I experienced at Yale. But it was his related theory of the scapegoat and what it revealed about Christianity that made me reconsider my faith. Any suspicion who is the author of this quote? Judith Butler? No, it's not Judith Butler. Yes? Me? No, it's not me. Good try. I'm glad it's not me in this particular case because it is J.D. Vance. J.D. Vance fell under the spell of Peter Thiel as Thiel went to Yale to give a lecture, and he started reading Girard and converted to Christianity after reading Girard. This is a quote from an article he wrote, I think, in 2020 already. He says, "In Christ, we see our efforts to shift blame and our own inadequacy onto a victim for what they are, a moral failing, projected violently upon someone else. Christ is the scapegoat who reveals our imperfections and forces us to look at our own flaws rather than blame our society's chosen victims." I think that Vance is a good understanding of Girard, theoretically. I mean, this is an accurate account, I would say. And he speaks in rather candid terms about his change of heart and is self-critical about himself. Mired in the swamp of social media, we identified a scapegoat and digitally pounced. We were keyboard warriors, unloading on people via Facebook and Twitter, blind to our own problems. And then he says, that all had to change. It was time to stop scapegoating and focus on what I could do to improve things. Wonderful, right? This is a wonderful program. This is 2020, right? And unfortunately, this is what I mean with a pathology, or let's say a pathology, a critical discourse, a very conscious understanding of the pathology of scapegoating and the violence can turn into a pathology if one considers that only a certain group deserves to be respected. As you know, J.D. Vance is even more virulent than Trump on ending programs for even legal immigrants. So here it's one of the cases in which mimetic theory has been read and used by the far right. There was on Point, National Public Radio in the US, a recent episode on René Girard, which was actually, I think, recommended. Jack Beatty and Meghna Chakrabarty that argue about the importance of reading Girard, because his theory of the scapegoat actually works. It is something that works not only in theory, but in political practice. And the problem is that although this was obviously not Girard's intention, right? His intention was the opposite, generating scapegoating mechanisms to recognize the truth of mimetic desire and rivalry in us, the violence in us. Although this was not Girard's intention, mimetic theory can be turned into a manual for new fascist leaders, as the examples of Vance suggest. And so this kind of gives a context for this urgence of mimetic studies to foster non-violent, pathological solutions in dialogue with Girard's non-violent spirit. So to move towards the final part, I want to say a few more things, a few more steps that go beyond the rivalry principle. Girard developed a theory of mimetic rivalry, and I cannot stress it enough. Mimetic desire, mimetic rivalry, mimetic scapegoating, these are real mechanisms. They do work, and so we should study them. At the same time, I don't think it's the only way of thinking about mimetic relations. And I propose the concept of mimetic agonism, specifically to think about the intellectual relations between theorists or philosophers or critics. What do I mean with mimetic agonism? An example of mimetic agonism is there at the beginning of what I call mimetic studies in Plato's critique of Homer. Plato famously bans the poets at the end of Republic. And so sometimes we teach a little bit in a rush to our students that Plato is critical of the poets, but nothing could be farther from the truth. If one has read a couple of lines of the Republic, Plato is a marvelous storyteller. He borrows narrative tools from his model, Homer, and he uses this model and the tools that he learns from, in this case, him, as tools to push against it. It's an ambivalent move in which the model is providing critical tools that can be used for critique. And what we usually see, mimetic agonism is the opposition, Plato contra Homer, but it's actually with and against. It's a double move. Another example would be Aristotle and Plato on mimesis. Obviously, Plato is critical of mimesis. Aristotle develops a defense of mimesis in the Poetic. But the continuities between the two on concepts like catharsis, I've developed this elsewhere, are very, very strong. Nietzsche had written a text that he didn't publish in his lifetime titled Homer's Contest. And he argued that there are two goddesses, two manifestations of the goddesses Eris, the goddess of strife. One of them that leads to jealousy, resentment, and cruelty. And if you read Homer context, you will see that it's a perfect description of mimetic rivalry. And a good Eris that provokes human beings to action, greatness producing greatness. Nietzsche's colleague at Basel, Jakob Burckhardt, had developed the idea of the agonal age, an age in which competition, be it in Olympic Games or poetic contest, was the context in which excellence could be produced. And that, I think, can provide a starting point for thinking about mimetic agonism. So the relationship between Nietzsche and Plato, for instance, Nietzsche is not simply critical of Plato. Nietzsche is in a mimetic agon with Plato. And I would argue the same between Girard and Freud. The proximities that I mentioned in passing above, and I developed more in detail in this book on violence and the edible unconscious, indicate that the two are actually, or Girard is thinking was with and against Freud. Now, this is a form of intellectual confrontation that acknowledges the precursor, and I don't hide that I think I have a kind of form of friendly agonistic relation with Girard. I learn from Girard, and yet at the same time, I try to think with and against him in order to push mimetic studies further. This leads us to the last concept that I want to introduce, and it's the one of the mimetic unconscious, and it's summing up some of the points that I've been saying. The starting point is that we are embodied intersubjective creatures open to affect, this notion of pathos that I emphasized. It starts with the body. The body is the great reason. It's an unconscious that doesn't generate a split or a Spaltung between consciousness and the unconscious that is only available by the interpretation of dreams, but it has to do with degrees of consciousness. It's late in the day, you have to listen to a lecture and so forth. Your consciousness is different than in the morning when you wake up. Just as an aside, Hitler used to have his speeches in the evening because he realized that in the evening it was easier to cast a spell on the crowd. So during the day, we go through different phases of consciousness, and we might be kind of fluctuating sometimes. I call that pathos of distance, a kind of spectrum of consciousness. And the unconscious goes beyond this binary between the mind and the body, self and others. It's a physiopsychological, to use Nietzsche's term, that it's a physiopsychological unconscious, so which neurologists to study the brain pay attention also how the brain affects breathing, digestion, and so forth. There is not this dualistic division between the two. In that sense, I think it differs from the Freudian unconscious. And it's manifested intersubjectivity. Every time that we are in a relation, facial expressions, what I was discussing before, especially if you are in a group or in a crowd, on social media, paying attention to what other people think, we are very much in a relation of unconscious mimesis, which can be good or bad, depending on the kind of relations that you develop. That's why the choice of models is so important. I didn't have time to develop it today, but it's also linked to hyperreal simulations, things that happen online that have ultra-real effects on our bodies. It really matters what social media we consume, what feeds we have in our socials. They do affect our physiology. And so it's a tradition of the unconscious that has a long genealogy. It can be traced back to magnetism in Anton Mesmer, who believed in a fluid, in a physical fluid, but it was actually a psychological fluid. Theorists of hypnosis in the late 19th century, like Hippolyte Bernheim, spoke of hypnotic influence. And contagion, the way I think of it, is very much in line with this tradition of the mimetic unconscious, which has recently been confirmed by the discovery of mirror neurons, recently, already 30 years ago. Mirror neurons influence hypnosis as a kind of VR agent to a mimetic psyche. So that's what I call the mimetic unconscious. And these concepts that I've been discussing, mimetic pathos, pathologies, pathos of distance, are the concepts that give conceptual birth to what I call homo mimeticus, and I'd like to conclude on that point. Nietzsche is often described as a philosopher who is attentive to violence, and it's true. He's also very sensitive to what I call the mimetic unconscious. He says, the mimicking of gestures is older than speech and takes place involuntarily even now. We cannot look upon facial movement without innervation of our face. Thus people learned to understand one another. Thus the child still learns to understand its mother. But understanding emerges out of this facial communication that goes on involuntarily, and in that sense, unconsciously. Nietzsche develops in gay science the hypothesis that we are born too soon and therefore are vulnerable and dependent on others. This kind of mimetic pathos that ties us to other generates bonds of sympathos, feeling with, not necessarily moral sympathy. It's a mimetic bond that can lead to collaboration instead of violence. This is a point that most recently the primatologist and anthropologist Sarah Blaffer-Hrdy makes, and she emphasizes mothers in a wonderful book titled Mothers and Others. She says that cooperative breeding came before braininess, that we developed a strong brain because newborns learned to, let's say, understand the emotions of different caregivers, what she calls alloparenting, in which mothers, but also aunts, uncles, and so forth were responsible for the caring of the child. And I think that here we have an interesting model to think about the emergence of Homo sapiens, Homo mimeticus, that emphasizes cooperation. Out of a constitutive vulnerability, we are humans are very vulnerable when we are born. We need others in our birth. And I'm actually very happy that my mother is here. And so it's, for me, nice moment to celebrate the power of mothers around. And I think my spouse is present as well, the mother of my children. And I think that all these theories of mimesis tend to focus on male figures. And I think that there is a lot to learn from bonds of maternal care in mimetic studies. Needs a feminist supplement. Sarah Blaffer-Hrdy says, without the capacity to put ourselves cognitively, this is the logos, and emotionally, the two are connected, in someone else's shoes, to feel what they feel, to be interested in their fears and motives, longings, griefs, vanities. Without this mixture of curiosity about emotional identification with others, a combination that adds up to mutual understanding and sometimes even compassion, Homo sapiens would never have evolved. I think it's an important lesson that we need to take in order to think mimesis beyond rivalry and violence, while acknowledging that rivalry and violence is not going to go away. So to sum up and conclude, to quote my good friend Adriana Caballero, we are all born from a mother and cared for by others, a plurality of others. Due to our mimetic nature, affective relations precede the ego and form us as relational creatures. So this intersubjectivity as primary is something that we need to consider, and moving away from this focus on the autonomous solipsistic subject. Sympathos, feeling with, is vital to our birth, but can easily be turned into violence. In periods of crisis, especially individualistic societies, neoliberal societies, this mechanism is very powerful. Hence the relevance of Girard's theory. But mimesis itself goes beyond good and evil. Hence the focus on this pathos that cut both ways. So my hypothesis is that collaboration, sharing, and mimetic communication, perhaps even more than sacrificial violence, led to the foundation of our culture. It's an hypothesis that I developed in relationship to Nietzsche, Sarah Blaffer-Hrdy, Adriana Caballero, and others. And my hope, and that's a hope, is that mimetic studies can help promote life-affirmative forms of imitation via plurality of means, but I think also by education. And so I conclude with what I started. In a moment in which education is in peril, I hope I could make an argument on the importance of imitation. Mimetic Studies is a collaborative project. I was blessed to have a team that worked on it, and I engaged in a number of dialogues with a number of influential thinkers across disciplines like literary studies, sociology, feminist philosophy, political theory. And I regret that I didn't have the opportunity to interview Girard and have him as part of these videos. But that's why I'm so honored to be here with you and to have a conversation about the future of mimetic theory, mimetic studies. I would like to conclude by thanking Barry and Dan for translating Homo Mimeticus, which I think should be out anytime soon. And thank you all for your attention.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you for joining. Thank you all for coming out. This is actually for my mother over there, so I have a good present for the mothers.